Welcome to What's for Lunch? Conversation about trends in and trade in food and ag and how they affect what's on your plate. This podcast examines current issues from a variety of perspectives, sometimes controversial and sometimes not, and always with a unique perspective. Our motto is always interesting, always lively, and today is going to be no different. I'm Susan Burns, your lunchtime host, and I'm thrilled to be here. We're having a late lunch today. I think you'll find it worth waiting for. I'm especially thrilled because we are having a one-on-one conversation with Alyshia Galvez. Alyshia is a professor at the City University of New York. She is also the author of several books. Her most recent book, The Taste or Eating NAFTA, Food Trade, I have to start that one over again. Her most recent book, I got all excited about it. Her most recent book, Eating NAFTA, Trade, Food Policies, and the Destruction of Mexico. That's what really got me interested in Alyshia's work. This book examines the impact that NAFTA has had on the Mexican food system, the culture, and food policy in general, as well as a whole host of other consequences, perhaps unintended. And now we're moving on to NAFTA 2 or the USMCA or USMCA, or it's been called a variety of other things. So it's only bound to get a little more complicated, and I don't think under the current arrangement much better. But I know that you will find Alyshia's work fascinating as I did. Welcome, Alyshia.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, Susan.
Yeah, it's so great to have you. I'm wondering, Alyshia, if we could start out with you talking about what actually led you to explore the impact of NAFTA on the Mexican food system. So what was it that just generated that, you know what, I got to take a look at this?
The thing that led me to this topic was that I had, in previous research projects, developed friendships and relationships with people who, largely Mexican migrants living in New York City and their family members living back in Mexico, who would comment to me when I would catch up with them or run into them. They would comment to me about how their family was doing. And I began to hear from a lot of friends and acquaintances, I began to hear stories about their family members' experiences with diabetes primarily, also kidney disease and some other chronic related illnesses. And I found this to be really strange because in my prior research, in keeping with a lot of public health research on the so-called immigrant paradox, I had understood that a lot of people who migrate to the U.S. Experience health benefits in their early stages of migration, and then over time, the U.S. tends to present a slow decline in health. The longer that people are here, the worse their health is. And so it seemed strange and paradoxical to me that people would be experiencing a health decline who had never migrated in communities that so many people had told me were places where people ate healthfully and lived close to the land and had lifestyles that were conducive to health. And that's what sort of piqued my curiosity and led me to try to figure out what exactly was going on. Was this, a fluke that the people I knew happened to have high rates of diet-related illness, or was there something else going on? And then, of course, I realized that in the 20 years since NAFTA, Mexico has experienced an epidemic of diet-related illness, especially diabetes, and a rise in rates of obesity, which we can debate whether obesity is something to be considered pathological or not, but it's certainly correlated with the rise in chronic disease. And so I became interested in that, and that's what led me into this research.
So in your research ultimately culminated in the book that I mentioned very inartfully in the beginning. But so did you start with reading? Did you start with a trip to Mexico? How did you start doing your research?
All of the above. So I have a clipping file that I throw things into whenever they're odd or interesting to me. Usually years before I kind of decide I'm going to do research on something, I've already got a clipping file going where I'm throwing things. And, of course, most of my clippings never lead to research projects. But this was a subject that I had sort of started to pay attention to before I ever thought I would do a formal study on it. Because I was interested and perturbed in, how the food system was changing. And the other thing in my clipping file, I have a different clipping file for recipes and food-related clippings, which are, restaurant reviews. And I'm an avid home cook, and I love to eat. I especially love to eat and cook Mexican food. And so I had a, parallel clipping file where I was saving all my restaurant tips and restaurant reviews and recipes, and I began to notice this incredible boom in Mexican food globally, right? So the New York Times was suddenly having all of these reviews of delicious, tacos, not Tex-Mex or kind of the Americanized version of tacos that we've had in the past, but really, good, fresh, ground corn masa, handmade tortillas. And so I was interested in both of those things. And because of my work, because of an administrative role that I had, I was traveling to Mexico quite a bit. And I also go to Mexico quite a bit for pleasure with my family. It's one of the places that my kids have spent a lot of time participating in a summer camp every year. And so, all of this put together led me to start, paying attention at first, kind of half attention, just sort of living my life and noticing these things. And then, eventually in 2013, 2014, I said, I really need to start focusing on this directly and really take a deep dive into the literature and, be more systematic in my inquiries. And so that's what led me to design a research study that combines ethnographic research, where I talk to people who are directly impacted. I also studied policy and talked to policymakers, nonprofits and nutritionists and dietitians who are working on the front lines of this epidemic. And then also, all the secondary literature. So that was kind of how it all came together.
Interesting. And so I like that, to know that background, because I think a lot of people don't understand what really goes into putting something like this together, and the amount of research it takes, and the varieties to present something as compelling as you have. Obviously,
thank you.
More of a global review of what's going on. Is there something that really surprised you a lot when you started doing your work, or was it as you had surmised after reading everything in your clippings folder?
Well, I have to say, just going back to the research design question, it's something that I talk to students about a lot, because I think students oftentimes are sort of overwhelmed about the idea of research, and they think research somehow requires some sort of superhuman, skill set. And, I always explain to them that, we do research all the time. And whenever we ask a question and look for an answer to it, we're doing research. Obviously, a lot of the research that we do is in the academy is much more complex and deeper, and we have to, sustain it for a much longer period than we would with, just a question that occurs to us in our day-to-day lives. But essentially, it's the same thing. And I think the other important thing about that is when we're passionate about something, it gives us that stamina to really pursue something as deeply as we need to really find the answers to our questions. So I think it's important, for anybody, kind of working with students or kind of talking about the research process, that we don't think about it as some sort of intellectual skill set that's sort of divorced from the rest of our lives. If it's something that's driven by the things that we're passionate about, then it's when it is truly, kind of authentic and meaningful. But related to that, thinking about the surprises, I think that it's really important to, to be attentive to where things are paradoxical, or there's some sort of disconnect between, what's happening and the stories we are told, or the stories we're telling about what's happening. And I think that's, for me, the most surprising thing. I would have to say
What
that,
do you mean by that? The story?
Yeah. So for me, the most surprising thing, perhaps, is the fact that, we have been, I want to say we, in the global sense, but certainly those of us who are living in the NAFTA signatory countries in Mexico, U.S., and Canada, we've allowed ourselves to be convinced, it's largely a marketing ploy, but we've allowed ourselves to be convinced that so-called diet-related illnesses like diabetes are a result of behavior, that somehow we are, people who are sick, it's because they lack nutrition, education, or more discipline, more exercise, more moderation in their diets. And, what we are blind to are the structural causes, the way that almost every aspect of the political and economic landscape in the signatory countries has been altered as a result of globalization. And so NAFTA has completely transformed the way that most Mexican people live. And so the idea that, the very closely, correlated rise in diet-related illness would somehow be coincidental, that people would suddenly develop a sweet tooth or suddenly develop a taste for salty, unhealthy foods, it defies the imagination, but somehow that kind of seems to be the explanation that gets given for this epidemic, that, somehow people suddenly need more nutrition education and more exercise, instead of really looking at how life has been altered and addressing the structural causes for chronic disease. And I think that, for me, is, kind of my life mission at this point, is to really draw attention to that.
So it isn't a case of so many Mexicans becoming food zombies one day and craving Coca-Cola and potato chips, but
exactly
more a function of the policy changes that came about because of NAFTA.
Exactly.
So explain a little bit. I mean, I know there are so many, it's kind of hard because there's so many different permutations and angles, alleys to go down, but explain just a little bit, so NAFTA is enacted, and how does that impact life in Mexico?
Yeah.
What does take place, and how does that lead to this decline in health, both in the U.S. and Mexico for Mexicans, and in the immigration, and there's so many things. But so what happens?
Right. Yeah, you're right. There are so many ways, there are so many details that we could describe, and it can be difficult. And that was one of my challenges with the book, was to try to capture all the complexity and the multifactorial nature of these sorts of things without losing, some explanatory force, to try to see how it all fits together into a puzzle. And so I think, for NAFTA, what we see is overall there's a disinvestment and an abandonment of small-scale farming. There's an abandonment of the countryside and of rural people. And there's a simultaneous investment in both large-scale agriculture as well as the concept of food security. Food security sounds like a good thing, right? When we're talking about an individual household, a food secure household has the ability to provide for its food needs. But when we're talking at the level of the nation state, food security means the ability to provide food for the population. It actually is completely agnostic as far as whether that food should be produced in the country or purchased on the global market. And so
I
the
think
shift towards
that's a difference in food security from global business perspective,
sovereignty,
as compared to a human rights perspective of food sovereignty, food security.
Exactly. So food sovereignty is the notion, that a place should be able to provide its own food needs. And food security is, well, it doesn't matter how its needs are met as long as it can afford the food that it needs. Mm-hmm. And so the shift towards food security that came along with NAFTA was a deliberate policy calculus that basically said, Mexico there are a lot of assumptions built in, but one of the assumptions is that Mexico doesn't do very well farming corn, even though it's the birthplace of corn and has been doing it for thousands of years.
That really was
right? There's this sort of idea that because Mexico has relatively low yield per hectare, that Mexico shouldn't really bother farming corn, and the United States, which has, famously prolific cornfields in the whole Midwest, should be growing all the corn for everybody, and with the money that Mexico is going to have, and this is the calculus at the beginning of the NAFTA era, with the money that's going to come from NAFTA and from the industrialization of the economy, the purchasing power will be increased, and so the small scale farmer can be liberated from growing corn, and with their wages from their job building cars or air conditioners, they can purchase their food, and Mexico in turn can purchase food on the global market to supply its population. The thing with this is that it, in addition to being based on some faulty assumptions, which I debunk in the book, this also basically is the dream scenario for the large scale corporations, which are poised, and large scale industrial farming, which is poised to kind of scale up on this multinational scale through very chemical intensive, tech intensive ways of farming that involve incredible consolidation of land, involve incredible proliferation of patented seed technology and herbicides, and so it's a bonanza for the Monsantos of the world, and all of the different corporations that benefit from this very high tech consolidated industrial agriculture system. And also, the kind of corn, of course, that we grow in the Midwest in the U.S. is very suitable for ethanol and for corn starches, corn syrup, all the industrialized food products that we can make from corn derivatives. But it's not the same kind of corn that historically in Mexico goes into the tortilla, in which, people grow their own corn, grind it, and make tortillas fresh every day. It's really not suitable for that kind of use. And so we see,
we always called it pig corn. Because
exactly.
there was a
so we sort of see this
big cornfields when I was a kid growing up, and we'd walk by these massive cornfields, but we knew that they fed that corn to the pigs. So it was pig.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very conducive. It's very useful for expanding animal, it's useful as animal feed, and it's very useful for expanding production of meat and dairy. But it's not so useful as far as, sustaining culturally relevant ways of eating. Mm-hmm. And so what we see is, this sort of fiction that gets constructed, that corn is corn and food is food, and it doesn't really matter who's making it or where it's coming from, which, by some scales, of course, it makes sense. It's logical, right? If we're thinking about, hunger versus, lack of hunger, you want calories, you want sufficient food for the population. But what wasn't really taken into consideration is how drastically this would alter lifestyles, how displaced people would be from the countryside in such great numbers, leading to massive migration, and, the health impacts of eating, hyper-processed industrial foods versus eating traditional foods. None of this was sort of taken into consideration. And so we see this massive epidemic of chronic disease that really isn't because people have, decided to change, their preferences as far as foods. It's really about what comes closer into reach and what goes further out of reach, what becomes cheaper and what becomes harder to access. And so that shift has really had major health consequences.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I think you talk about in your book is that not only does it shift the kind of food that's available or impact the kind of food that's available and the daily diet, but it also has an impact on immigration.
Yes, that's right. So we see, within a decade of NAFTA, we see 1 in 10 Mexicans living in the United States. and even more people being displaced internally within Mexico from their rural communities of origin outward into cities and other states. And so we see this massive displacement from the countryside. Some of this was anticipated. So the Mexican negotiators anticipated that approximately 50,000 peasants would be displaced from the countryside. They were wrong by quite a lot, and as many as 10 million Mexicans were displaced. And we see, a lot of the things that are happening now in terms of debates in the United States about the wall and immigration. A lot of that, those debates are product of, the fact that NAFTA, unlike, for example, the European Union, NAFTA sought to link the three countries of North America together, but didn't seek to take down barriers to the mobility of people. So in the European Union, we see that people can move across borders and work, and there's no difference in work eligibility if a person goes from one nation to another within the European Union. But NAFTA essentially created a union for economic purposes, for the circulation of goods and capital, but people were not on the table. The United States was unwilling to discuss human mobility. And so because we have that sort of false and arbitrary stifling of human mobility at the same time that we see this liberation of the mobility of goods and capital, we have a very lopsided, unstable system that's generated from the very start. And, people go where the jobs are. And so we see, the shift in the location of jobs. We see this precarity in the countryside that we never saw before, where people can't continue to subsist in the ways that they did historically in the rural parts of Mexico. And so we see this, massive instability, and migration becomes a safety valve for it. And, these are all, each family makes their own decisions for their own reasons. But when we zoom out and we see this massive flow of people, we can see it's patterned, and we can see that it's the result of policy making.
Interesting. Am I connecting the right dots here? So NAFTA, one of the results of NAFTA is that it displaces rural, primarily agrarian people.
That's right.
It increases the flow of migrants to the United States.
That's right.
And now we're complaining about the Mexican immigrants in the United States. Not all of us, but
that's right.
At policy level. So we're complaining about a problem that we basically created.
We created it.
Is a problem, but it's an issue that we created.
Yes, exactly. It was an issue that was created that could have been prevented. There were debates at various moments in time to precisely regulate and regularize the flow of people. And those discussions were tabled. They were tabled before NAFTA. They were tabled again right before September 11th. Vicente Fox and George Bush were talking about, a program that would involve guest workers and increased mobility of people across the border. And that was tabled after September 11th. And so we've had various moments where we could have, done something about this, and we haven't. And now, ironically, there are far more people leaving the United States for Mexico than coming from Mexico to the United States. And the vast majority of the humanitarian crisis that we see on the border now is the product of a different scenario of policy decisions on the part of the United States that destabilized a different region in Central America. But when we're talking about NAFTA and Mexican migration, we can really see the domino effect that was created by this, lopsided deal that didn't take into consideration the human consequences of the economic policy changes.
It's just mind-boggling to me, and maybe one of the reasons President Trump wants the wall built is to keep people in the United States.
It's possible. We do have a looming demographic problem. People are not having enough babies. We're going to have those of us who want to retire sometime in the next couple of decades are going to have an issue.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, I've read little bits about the new president of Mexico, Lopez Obrador, or AMLO, as he is referred to, taking some steps with regard to returning some of the agricultural power to farmers, small rural farmers. Do you have any insight on that? And do you think that there's anything that will be he'll actually be effective in doing anything to counter some of the negative impacts of NAFTA, and in particular when the USMCA is coming up for another big push for passage?
That's right. I'm cautiously optimistic that we are in a new era in terms of the Mexican policy landscape with AMLO's presidency. He hasn't inspired a huge amount of confidence in me in the last several weeks in the way he's been implementing his policy goals. However, when he was elected, he campaigned on this and then he came into office with a lot of specifics. His stated goal was to make Mexico food sovereign again. So, the last statistics I have from the prior presidency, Mexico was importing 41% of its food, and AMLO says that Mexico should be producing 100% of its food and not importing so much. So this is, the first time we've heard a Mexican president essentially since Lázaro Cárdenas, who was one of the, famous post-revolutionary presidents early in the 20th century. It's the first time we've heard anyone talk about investing in the countryside and investing in small-scale agriculture. Every other presidency, whether it's been left-leaning or right-leaning, more globally oriented or more nationalistic, has seen progress and modernity and prosperity coming from the consolidation and industrialization of agriculture. And there's been a distinctive disdain and disrespect towards small-scale producers, and an understanding that they needed to kind of get with the program and modernize and consolidate into larger and larger industrial farms if they were going to be productive and economically viable. And we see with AMLO a completely different approach, seeing the countryside as a source of prosperity, as it actually has been always. It's been quietly subsidizing every stage of Mexico's progress. But we see this acknowledgement of that role of the small-scale producer, the value of the small-scale producer. And we see an advertisement, there was an advertisement of a fellowship program, sort of an AmeriCorps-style service program. Mexico already requires university graduates to do a year of service in somewhere in the country related to their studies. And so we see a call for agronomers and anthropologists and sociologists to work in the countryside and really address, really capture a lot of the knowledge and the ideas about sustainability, the deep, indigenous epistemologies for working with the land in a context of climate change and in a context of, change in general. And so I think we're going to see some interesting things come out. I think that already the way that AMLO, even though some people say AMLO is kind of a populist and people sort of loosely compare him to Trump because he has big rallies, I think he's singing a very different tune, and he has a very different policy program, and he's appointed scholars, researchers with incredible academic expertise in the areas that they've been asked to lead. He's been appointing them to all of the cabinet positions. And so, unlike what's happening here where we see, kind of lobbyists and industry insiders, the wolves guarding the hen house, we see in Mexico, an effort to empower experts in their fields to lead agencies and lead the coming administration's policies. And so I think we might see some interesting things coming out of it. And I think that approach is what made Trump try to hustle and get the USMCA signed before it was literally the last day of the prior president's term, that the agreement was symbolically signed with a lot of fanfare in Argentina by the three presidents. So, I think that rush on the part of Trump to kind of get it done and try to prevent AMLO from doing anything is a sign that he knows AMLO is not going to, be as amenable to Trump's position as the former president was. So we'll see what happens. I don't know actually what's going to happen, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
I like to hear that. That at least there is some optimism, because what's going to be interesting, because the NAFTA 2.0 as it's drafted, really, I mean, it is a corporate agriculture companies.
Exactly.
And, with the genetically modified foods and the cross-contamination and all those issues, which we can spend another 2 or 3 podcasts on, but
exactly,
it's huge. So it will be really interesting to see. It's nice to know that there's at least a voice raising the issue and talking about it, because I think what happens is that the major corporations, they have their voices heard, but the
exactly,
we, the people who are impacted, have no input. If AMLO is successful in making some of these changes, what saddens me is like the homogenization of, I go to Mexico and there's a Walmart. I go to Mexico and there's, all the stores from the U.S. and it's so homogenized. And I always loved the culture of Mexico and being able to travel to these little places and enjoy, as in any country, just different regions have different traditions and different cultures. And so I think a lot of that has gone by the by because of the impact of NAFTA, as you talk about. But do you think it's too late? I mean, do you think any of that will come back? Will it be rebuilt? Will it always stay vibrant? Or what do you think about the culture and how we...
I don't think it's too late. We're in a danger zone, but I don't think it's too late. And I hope it's not too late for the United States either. I mean, I remember taking road trips as a teenager, and every town that you would go into would have its own, specialty, its own little mom and pop owned cafe that would have its own regional specialties. And we lost that in the United States.
Yes.
Denny's after Starbucks after Dunkin' Donuts. And we've had this sort of corporate, as you describe it, homogenization of our food culture, where you can kind of eat the same way, and we do eat the same way no matter what region and no matter what season, and it's depressing. And in Mexico, it's more recent. This transformation is more recent. So I have to think that it's not too late. There are still lots of people who still sustain in their own households, to the degree that they can, these, very micro local practices. I remember sitting in my friend's kitchen, and her neighbor came by and she said, "Look what's in bloom." And she brought us cacayas, which are a flower that grow on a specific cactus in that region, and they only bloom for 3 or 4 days a year. And so her neighbor dropped by the cacaya flowers, and we had an omelet that was made with them that was delicious. And if I hadn't been there that day, I never would have tried the cacayas. It's not the kind of thing you'd ever see in a market. It's not the kind of thing you can see more than a couple of days a year. So I was lucky to see it. But that's the kind of regional variety that we still have, but we have to know, we have to value it, right? So the person who picks the cacayas or who grows their own corn can't be seen as some sort of quixotic, throwback to another era. We have to value it. We have to recognize it. We have to celebrate it and look for it and make it possible so that people don't have to migrate, so that people don't have to disrupt their family structure in order to economically survive. And I think that, I don't believe that we as consumers have as much power as corporations like to make us think we do, because they're trying to get us to not think about the policy implications of their, of their business practices on a large scale. But we as consumers do have power to say, you know what, I don't want to eat the same thing every day, and I don't want to eat the same thing in this place as in that place. And so, we can really ask for and celebrate these micro local sorts of practices and food items, and celebrate them, not just for tourism, which, Mexico is doing. If you look at their, tourism board materials, they're celebrating Mexico as a site for culinary, gastronomic tourism, but also for health, also for economic well-being. It should be profitable to stay put and make these, delicious foods, or these, local sorts of practices and products. That should be feasible. It should be economically viable. People shouldn't be stuck in places that they don't want to be stuck in, but they also shouldn't be forced to move.
Mm-hmm. You just triggered in my brain. I went on a trade mission with Governor Dayton to Mexico a couple of years ago, and we were in Jalisco, and I met with some people in the agriculture. I don't remember now which section of the government, if it was Zagarpa or what, but they were actively doing a push to invite people back from the United States, to entice people back to move back, and promise that. And so they must have had some things in place, and I never was able to follow up on that, but find out if that program was successful. But that's what the promise was, that they were working on, was come home, and you'll have a stable life in agriculture here. I never had a chance to follow up on that, and I don't know, but keep your ears open for that to see if you hear anything.
I will.
About that.
I will. Yeah, the wonderful photojournalist David Bacon has a nice series and a book called The Right to Stay Home, where he really focuses on this in terms of migration in general. I think so much of how we think about migration, even the word immigration is a biased word, because it's a word that contains within it the perspective of the state. Because if we say immigration, it's the idea of people migrating into our place, right? Immigration is migrating out. And so if we think about migration rather as movement, right, without getting too wrapped up in what kind of movement and what direction it is, then we can see that people move, in very logical ways, and ways that are about, creating a viable life chances for themselves and their children. And we have to be attentive to these things and think about, what is it that makes it possible for people to stay? Because most people, if we think about immigration as a sort of thing where, of course, people are trying to come and they're trying to take advantage, and, everything is so great, we miss the fact that most people don't want to leave home.
Right.
There's a poet who writes, Orson Shire, who writes, home, people don't leave home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And I think most people, would much prefer to not leave everything behind, certainly not in the very precarious, dangerous, and expensive ways that we've forced migrants to operate when they are trying to migrate. And making it possible for people to have more chances, more choices to stay or leave, to circulate within their country or beyond, without having it be, a life or death decision, a decision that can be economically bankrupting as well as, so risky. So I think that these are things that we need to think about in a much more imaginative way.
Agreed. So, you talked a little bit about consumers. I want to touch on, before we end here, I want to touch on what consumers can do. And I mean, people can join advocacy groups. There are a variety of advocacy groups, but not everybody has time or the penchant for advocacy. As a consumer, what are some practical things that people can do that can impact?
Well, one thing
Margaret Mead.
Well, one thing we can do is, and this is not really advocacy. It's sort of advocacy light. We can ask our congressional representatives, why are vegetables so expensive, and what are you going to do to make healthy foods less expensive? There's a report that came out today that that bad diets are the cause of most deaths in the world. It's getting a lot of attention. But essentially, it's expensive to eat in ways that we know to be healthful. It's expensive to eat in ways that are traditional to most cultures. And it's gotten cheaper and cheaper to eat stuff that we know is not good for us, highly processed, high sugar, high fat, junk food that the corporations are foisting on us. And so these are policy decisions, right? There are certain policies that are making it easier for cheap food, bad food to be cheap, and good food to be expensive. And so we can have a policy shift on that. And if we just ask our elected representatives, what are you doing to prioritize health in our food system? That's a simple ask, and it would help alert politicians that we do care about this, because there's an assumption that nobody cares about trade deals or farm bills. And that's largely true because most of us are not aware of how this gets onto our plate or into our bodies. The other thing we can do is, ask for diversity at the supermarket, in our consumption practices. We can say, are these the best tomatoes you can sell me at supermarket, or are you buying, as you described, Susan, the grainy pink fleshed industrial tomatoes that don't really taste like tomatoes, that are most of what's available to us. That's not the best that we can get. And if the retailers know that we know what a good tomato tastes like, and we expect them to sell us them, then they're going to have a different approach to procurement, and they're going to approach different kinds of food producers. And so, these are things that the marketplace can demand, and it should be widely available. These are things that should be available to all of us, not just those of us who have the luxury of shopping in fancy seasonal farmers markets.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Also, one of my friends does absolute fits, but I ask at restaurants too. Like where does this beef come from, and do you have anything organic on the menu, and things like
Absolutely.
that. I always ask the questions.
I'm the same way. Every time I eat a taco, I ask, where are your tortillas coming from? Do you make your own tortillas? Are you grinding your own corn? And those are fair questions. If you're in a Mexican restaurant, you can ask about their tortillas.
Mm-hmm. Am I eating real corn or pig corn?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so, NAFTA does affect what's for lunch and what's on our plates. I mean, we have like a lot of lovely fruits that come from Mexico that I can eat in the wintertime and that I wouldn't otherwise have. And I was trying to remember before NAFTA what did we eat in the winter? I don't know.
We didn't eat all these avocados. I can tell you that.
Avocados and blueberries.
I'm from California. My grandmother had an avocado tree, so I grew up eating, delicious avocados. But when I moved at the age of 18 to go to college in the Northeast, I didn't see an avocado for years. They were out of my price point, and when I would splurge on one, it would usually go bad immediately and be mushy and terrible. So getting good avocados is a wonderful side effect of NAFTA, but it shouldn't come at the expense of our neighbors', well-being and justice.
Well, also, I think it impacts what's on our plates too, because it's given, it's the whole thing with the major corporations and all the whole policy of the whole food system has shifted, and it is, as you said, it's like the same everywhere. We're eating the same thing over the same processed foods, and so I think. I don't know. I love avocados too, but I don't know that if it had to be a trade on, either go without avocados and have a decent food system. I think I would go without the avocados in the winter and love them all the more in the summer. I don't know.
Yeah.
It just.
Yeah. I mean, when we are connected, when we're deeply connected to seasonality and when we're deeply connected to food producers, then we're more able to understand that there are trade-offs, and we'll wait for those good tomatoes when they're being grown nearby, because we know that the window when a really good tomato is really good, it's not enough time to ship it 1,500 miles in any direction. So we can be attentive to that if we have a greater awareness of how these things operate, and I think we can make those decisions. Right now, Trump is threatening to close the border any minute now. And one of the things that has been circulating on social media is that the U.S. would run out of avocados in 3 weeks. And that, people are joking about, that's the problem, right? Not the humanitarian crisis that's on the border, but God forbid we should run out of avocado toast. But we have to connect the dots on these. I mean, all of these issues, there's no talking about avocados without talking about migration and organized crime and the relationship, the unequal, bullying relationship between the United States and Mexico and the rest of Latin America. We really need to address these issues in the same frame. And if it takes, being concerned about our avocados running out to get us aware of the global networks that are shaping these issues and these policies, then so be it.
Amen. Whatever it takes, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Alyshia. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
I've learned a lot, and I look forward to the next time we connect. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before I am closing off? But is there anything else you wanted to add? I should have asked.
I think you covered everything. They were wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Take care. Thanks a lot. It's wonderful to work with you.
Likewise. And what's for lunch in May? In May, we're going to be talking with people about cell-cultured meat and if it will be on your plate this year. May 9th is our next podcast at noon. What's for lunch at noon Central. So we'll be talking about the status of the USDA FDA regulatory landscape for cell-cultured protein, and more from a global perspective and what's going into it, not in the nitty-gritty of regulations. And, what is it that needs to happen in order for cell-cultured meat and protein, any kind of protein, to be on your plate? But we're talking about meat, poultry, and fish products, not the plant-based. So the one concern that I have in that area is if the safety and environmental issues are being properly addressed, and we are going to explore that in depth. So I look forward to talking with you in another month. Thanks.